Hi everybody, my name is Nate, and this is D&D Rules School. Class is about to start. Welcome to D&D Rules School, right here on WASD 20. Some of you may have seen my series, How to Play D&D. It's a solid introduction to the game in which I actually go through a sample session of the game and talk about many of the rules as we progress through that session. I'll put a link right up there, and for newcomers to the hobby, I think it's a great introduction to what D&D is, because you learn a bit of the rules through the actual format of a game. Here in D&D Rules School, however, we'll be more focused on the rules with practical examples rather than an overarching narrative. These videos will be more structured and systematic and have more in-depth explanation. And I imagine there will eventually be far more episodes of this series than there were of How to Play D&D as we get deeper into the rules. Before we get into the rules, however, I do want to take a moment to thank Absolute Tabletop for partnering with me to help bring you this series. Absolute Tabletop makes some of my favorite RPG supplements, all of which work incredibly well with D&D 5th edition. They have a lot of great setting books, adventure modules, and Dungeon Master tools, and I highly recommend people check out the Oath of the Frozen King Adventure Kit. An adventure kit lives in that sweet spot between a fully fleshed out adventure module and Dungeon Master prep notes, and it's a super fun adventure that makes DMing very easy. There's a link in the video description, and if you use that link, it'll let them know I sent you. So definitely go have a look. Getting back to Rules School, I have to admit that having a new player start with a rules lecture isn't always best. So I do have two quick disclaimers for this series. Here they are. Disclaimer number 1. The best way to learn the game is just to show up and play. Just go. Don't feel like you need to understand all the rules before you show up to a game. As a Dungeon Master, I love when new players show up with an open mind and I can teach them the rules as we play. It's by far my preferred method. Disclaimer number 2. There is so much more to this game than the rules. I think this is such an important point that I'm thinking about maybe even going back to do an episode 0 about it, and if I do, I'll put a link right up there. The rules really only matter as much as you and your group want them to. There's absolutely nothing wrong with bending or breaking them if that's your group's preferred style. And then there's all the other stuff. Role play, be creative, be passionate, be a good friend. This is all so key to the experience of Dungeons & Dragons, and for many of us, the rules pale in comparison to these elements. Now, the rules. Since this is episode 1, here's a quick explanation of what D&D is for the complete newcomer. D&D is a tabletop role-playing game, which means it's a collaborative storytelling experience in which one person plays the role of the Dungeon Master. That person controls the goings-on of the game world and all the non-player characters, and they sort of act as the facilitator or the lead storyteller. The players, on the other hand, only control one character each. The DM explains a scene and sets things in motion, and the players can choose what their characters will do. So for you players or aspiring players out there, try to think about what your character would do. That's the first rule. Listen to the Dungeon Master, ask questions about the scenario if you'd like, and then act in character. This is the heart of role-playing. Now, to get into the specific rules for D&D 5th edition, the 20-sided die is at the heart of the game. We call this the D20. The experience of listening to the DM and telling her what you'd like your character to do can take us pretty far. We can tell some really cool stories just with that. But can you do anything? It's one thing to have your character walk up to the barkeep and say, "I'll have a pint of ale." But it's quite another to walk up to a dragon and decide you'd like to go for a ride. So in most tabletop RPGs, we use dice to determine the results. Success, failure, or something in between. Most of the time, these things come down to the roll of the dice. Anything you want to do in-game can either succeed or fail based on the roll of a D20. The Dungeon Master might not require a roll for everything. To some extent, it's a matter of play style. But when the Dungeon Master wants to infuse an element of chance, you could succeed or you could fail, a D20 is rolled. So what are the basic rolls on the D20? We'll talk about these actions in more detail later, but for now, you have an ability check, firstly. When your character wants to do something that has a chance of failure, they make an ability check. Saving throws. A saving throw is an attempt to resist or avoid something that is happening out there in the environment external to the character. And lastly, you have an attack, and I think you probably know what that is. Now, is it all up to the roll of a d20? No, it's not. Your character's stats can increase or decrease your modifier or bonus on the d20. On this character sheet, we can see the modifiers are the small numbers that usually have a plus or a minus next to them. These are the numbers you add or subtract from the d20 roll. We have some by ability scores that act as a base number, and those help us determine the numbers we'll put for saving throws, skills, attacks, and more. The big question now is, what do I need to roll to succeed? And the answer is, you need to hit the specific target number for that situation. This target is usually described as either difficulty class or armor class. So firstly, difficulty. Difficulty class is the number needed to succeed in most non-combat situations. Sometimes it's written out in the materials, but other times the Dungeon Master has to make something up. This can be a bit subjective. Even when we use this chart that's included in a lot of the official materials, the Dungeon Master still has to decide if jumping out of the way of a large boulder that is rolling my way, for example, is going to be medium, hard, or perhaps somewhere in between. Let's just say that I, as the Dungeon Master, determine that my player needs to roll a 16. Well, I happen to have a d20 here, so let's give it a try. We're going for a 16. On my character sheet, let's say that my character has a modifier for dexterity of +2. I got an 18. I add my dexterity saving throw bonus, which is +2, and that brings me to 20. I deftly dodge out of the way of the boulder, avoiding being crushed. So that's how it works, and that was an unusually happy ending. There are a couple other ways difficulty class can be determined that don't involve such a subjective decision of the Dungeon Master. One of those is spell save DC. This is the number I need to roll to avoid the effects of a spell. We get this number on the character sheet or stat block of the creature casting the spell. Another example is a contest, and in this, 2 players, or a player and the DM, roll against each other. I might make a stealth check to avoid being noticed as I run into the forest and an enemy is pursuing me. I would make a stealth check and I would add my relevant modifier. The enemy would make a perception check, add their relevant modifier. And then, if the enemy matches or exceeds what I rolled, I would be noticed. That's a contest or an opposed check. Lastly, when we are in combat to decide if an attack hits, we use armor class. The person rolls to make an attack, and they have to match or exceed the armor class in order to hit. And that number is provided in the monster manual or on someone's character sheet. So that's going to wrap up our first lesson here on D&D Rule School. Hopefully, if you're new, you now have a better feeling for how the game works. Just remember, think and act in character. Tell the DM what you want to do, and keep that D20 handy because it is at the heart of this game. Coming soon to D&D Rule School: advantage, disadvantage, critical success and failure, combat, magic, and much more. So make sure you're subscribed. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave those down below. If you enjoyed this one, please give it a thumbs up. Thanks again to Absolute Tabletop. Check out their stuff via the link below. And thank you for joining me here on D&D Rule School. Everybody take care. You'll see me again very soon.